Hey, what's going on guys? This is Coda, and I'm here today with a short little comparison and analysis video about the new High Elf Swordmasters of Hoeth. If you haven't seen it yet, which is unlikely, Total War released an incredible High Elf battle video on their YouTube channel. And in it, the stat cards of the Swordmasters and many of the other High Elf units were shown right on screen. Needless to say, the gameplay and models look absolutely incredible. Like all of them. But I took special note of the Swordmasters since they're one of my favorite High Elf units from Tabletop. That's why I did a little lore video on them as well. So in this video, we're going to quickly compare and contrast the Swordmasters with 3 other Greatsword Infantry units in the game. Well, you know, in Game 1. And those units are the Wood Elf Wildwood Rangers, the Empire Greatswords, and the Bretonnian Squires. So I think that these are the most comparable units in Game 1 to the Swordmasters. They're Greatsword Infantry, they're armored, they're armor piercing, they have a bonus versus something, so I do think that they'll be compared often. But first things first, all of the content shown in this video belongs to Creative Assembly and Total War. And in addition to that, the stats on the card for the Swordmasters are also a development in progress. That means that they could, and most likely will, change before the release of Total War Warhammer 2. Probably not by much, but maybe slightly. Now before we do a simple side-by-side comparison, we need to recognize that we're not exactly comparing apples to apples. The stat card of the Swordmasters looks to be taken from within a live battle setting, meaning that there could be buffs or alterations or something like that from other sources or abilities, not the least of which is the martial prowess special rule of the High Elves. So please don't take anything in this comparison video as concrete or absolute. Although I do anticipate that we will be fairly close, it still is just for fun. So let's get into it. It's important to identify the Swordmaster's battlefield role or their intended tactical purpose so we can be more accurate when comparing them to these other units. And although we'll soon find out that the Swordmasters share many stat trends with their kin in Athol Lauren, this first one isn't an example of that. Like the Greatswords and Squires, the Swordmasters have an anti-infantry bonus. So this makes the Wildwood Rangers the odd elf out, as they have an anti-large bonus. This is important because it indicates they are meant to be used in different ways. The ideal targets for the Swordmasters, Greatswords, and Squires are well-armored infantry units, while the Wildwood Rangers would be better spent facing heavily armored cav. The Swordmasters are also most closely comparable to the Empire Greatswords in their armor stat. Although not quite the impressive Greatsword armor of 95, the Swordmasters come in a very close second with an armor stat of 85. In addition, the Swordmasters will have some missile resistance, as indicated by the little bronze shield icon on their unit card. This is because in the fluff they're able to deflect shots and incoming arrows with their swords alone, which is pretty dope. The good armor of the Greatswords and Swordmasters is over double that of the Wildwood Rangers, a unit whose lack of armor is generally considered their primary weakness by most players. But from here on out, that's where most of the differences between the Swordmasters and Wildwoods end, as in they're more similar to each other than different. That's because in almost all other stats, the elves beat the humans in every way possible. Between the two, the elves hold the number 1 or number 2 spot in leadership, speed, melee attack, melee defense, weapon strength, charge bonus, and presumably armor piercing damage as well. Although it's difficult to distinguish exactly which stats of the Swordmasters are being buffed and which are part of their baseline profile, we can still use the values shown for the purpose of this video. And if we look at the exact values on their unit card alone, the Swordmasters are number 1 in leadership, melee attack, and definitely in melee defense. And then they are number 2 in speed, weapon strength, charge bonus, and again presumably armor piercing damage. In all of those stats, their buddies in the forest are number 1. But being similar to the Wildwood Rangers isn't all fun and games. The elves share another similarity in that they have a smaller unit size and a smaller HP pool when compared to the human units. The Swordmasters in particular have the lowest HP out of all 4 infantry units pictured here. So this stat, it seems, may be the Swordmaster's primary weakness. But overall, their pros far outweigh their cons, especially when it comes to the damage that they can deal. Although we can't see exactly how much of their weapon damage is armor piercing, or how large their anti-infantry bonus is for that matter, we may be able to come close based on patterns and deductive reasoning. For these other units, armor piercing damage correlates to weapon strength in the following way. The Wildwood Rangers are the highest with 32 armor piercing damage, or about 80%. Foot Squires are next with 26 armor piercing damage, roughly around 74%. I don't have the exact decimal numbers, and the Greatswords actually come in last with 23 armor piercing damage, or about 71%. Knowing that the Swordmasters have a weapon strength of 36, we could estimate that they'd have around 75 to 76% of that be armor piercing based on the rest of these patterns. So they come up just short of the Wildwood Rangers, but higher than that of the humans, and that's a trend that we see in most of the other stats as well. But in summary, based on this comparison and analysis, the High Elf Swordmasters stay true to their name. They deal large amounts of damage like the Wildwood Rangers, but they don't have the weakness of poor armor. And they have good armor like the Greatswords, but don't sacrifice speed or damage. And although we haven't really brought them up much, they do deal similar amounts of damage to the Foot Squires, which is generally very high, but they don't suffer from the poor leadership or poor melee defense, especially the poor melee defense. In fact, that's where they excel the most. The melee defense of the Swordmasters of Hoeth is probably the one stat that's going to set them apart from these units more than anything. That melee defense stat is defensive spear elite infantry tier. That's very good for an offensive unit. The Swordmasters are like a combination of Wildwood Rangers and Greatswords, wherein they take the best of each of them, maybe turn it down one notch, and then they end up as a very solid combination of great damage and great armor. I personally think they will slice and dice their way through infantry better than anything else in the game. Of course, based on the video and news today, the new Dark Elf units could be the ones that give them the run for their money. And as always guys, this is Coda, thank you for listening and take care.